Hi, everybody. Welcome to King County Recovery Conversations. I'm your host today, Christopher Archiopoli. My pronouns are he, him, his. I want to give special thanks to the King County Recovery Coalition, King County Behavioral Health and Recovery Division, and to Orbit Audio for hosting us today. Today, my guest is Tony Radovich, one of the greatest humans that I know, one of my favorite humans. I feel like I say that a lot of times when I'm doing these shows because I only know good people, but you really are one of my favorites. God, I've probably known you for almost 10 years by this point. I first entered recovery in 2016. So yeah, and I feel like I crossed paths with you very early on. One of my earliest memories of you is encouraging me to relax when I hugged you. I think about that a lot because I was so anxious and high stress when I first entered recovery, and you gave me a great hug and you told me to relax. And I think about that all the time. And then my other best memory of you, there's so many, but one thing that I say almost every day because of you is a lot of people say how often they hate things. You taught me the practice of saying, I love that. And I do love that. And I say it every day because of you. So there's a lot of influences there, but I could talk about you for a half an hour, but I am not going to talk about you for a half an hour. I want you to tell your own story because you can tell it far better than I can.
Wow, that was quite the introduction. Thank you for having me. Hello, everybody.
Hi. Well, what do you? So, I mean, start us off with like, what's your story? You know, what's your recovery story? Whatever you want to share, whatever you're comfortable with.
Well, I'm a person in long-term recovery, and my recovery journey began in a Swedish hospital. I was quarantined with one of the worst cases of MRSA that the health department had ever seen, and that began my journey. One of my best girlfriends, who was a nurse, came into the room. I could only have one visitor at a time, and she came in with a mirror and held it up to my face and said, "Look at you. Do you really want to be doing this for the rest of your life?" And that began my journey of recovery because it was a really critical point health-wise where it could go either way because just the nature of my infection at that time. And and then my recovery sort of coalesced at Bailey Boucher, where I found myself at the second floor because I had to I had a lot of health issues that had to be addressed. So, and then people just came and visited me and talked about recovery, and then I really sort of dedicated myself to like what did that look like for me, and so went to Seattle Counseling Service. Shout out to all the OGs out there. And, I was dedicated to my recovery. I didn't know what I was going to do after that. After I, quit my job abruptly, was unhoused for a few years and just floated, tried to hold down a job, but my addiction just didn't allow that. And I was a lost boy at that time. But the time at Seattle Counseling Service was really instrumental. And it allowed me to have sort of a broader idea of the interpretation of recovery. And it just sort of opened all sorts of doors for me, which was, many of us were at the perfect place at the perfect time is what I tell people. A lot of changes were happening there. And so, yeah.
And what do you do now? I mean, that's the early version of your recovery, but as you mentioned, you are a person in long-term recovery, and recovery changes as we get further into it. Our definition, at least I know for me, my definition has changed over the course of the last decade. What does that look like for you? How do you show up in community?
Well, I am focused on a few specific things. One is methamphetamine use, only because that's a huge part of my story and its impact on the queer community in regards to chemsex and party and play and all of that other things. And I'm a huge proponent of harm reduction and the role that stigma plays and how shame, for better, for worse, has an impact on people's lives, especially queer men, and the societal pressures that has on a multitude of layers. And so I like talking about unpacking shame a lot. and I think the most important part that I try to impart to people is that recovery is supposed to be uncomfortable.
Yeah.
And so, get comfortable being uncomfortable. And so I think I can remember a group of us sitting in Seattle counseling service, and the SUD counselor at the time said to all of, I think he kind of I think there was a quiet point in the group where he said, "You guys could be doing this," or I think he said, "You guys should be doing what I'm doing." And so that's how sort of different things started. But my recovery right now is about, I don't do synthetic drugs anymore. And they're just too unpredictable. And frankly, I'm a better person without synthetic drugs, right? Or alcohol. I don't drink alcohol. I cook with it, though. It's such an important part.
It does change the flavor profile. I 100% on board.
Yes.
Well, I think you've said several things that I want to touch on. One is just a statement. I remember the Lost Boys. The Lost Boys are hot, if I remember correctly, from the 80s. So definitely that's not a bad thing. Second question, I know what Bailey Boucher is. Do you mind explaining what Bailey Boucher is? Because I think they're such a vital service in this community, and they are still around, and they are very unique. And I bet a lot of people don't know what Bailey Boucher is.
Yeah, Bailey Boucher started in the 90s. It's down in Madison Valley, and it was designed. Well, the entire HIV continuum in Seattle was designed to support people from diagnosis to death. And we were replicated. The continuum was all across the country in regards to how to support people living with HIV from diagnosis to death. And and they do currently, because a lot has changed, people are living longer because of, antiretroviral treatment, right? So the needs of people living with HIV has changed, right? We're living longer, but things have become more acute in regards to the needs of individuals. And so Bailey Boucher changed, like a lot of other community-based organizations changed. And now they have a housing component, medication assistance, adult day health.
Yeah, they do food programs.
Shelter. Yeah, they do a lot.
They really do. I mean, and all specifically for people living with HIV still. Correct. I mean, even though their core service has sort of changed as the needs of the community have shifted, they still have stayed with that demographic of just people living with HIV, which is, it's not something that exists anywhere else, at least in Seattle. And I don't know where else there is a shelter specifically geared towards people living with HIV. I mean, I think it's a very special place.
Yeah, it is. Well, I think, people deserve a safe place to go, right? And I think people living with HIV, the reality is that they have complex needs now, and, mental health, and depending on the level of, substance use, there could be, psychosis and things like that. And I know several of the staff down there, and they are dedicated people. And I think it's a great, wonderful model in regards to how compassion and empathy is exhibited, and genuine care for people's health and well-being. And yeah, that was certainly modeled to me when I was there. So it stands true that they continue to provide that necessary, service to individuals. Yeah.
Yeah, I think that still shines through, and definitely shout out to Katie Hara, who is a rock star down there. I
love Katie.
She has so much energy, and every time I talk to her, she's on her way out the door, but then she's still there for another hour. So she's amazing.
Yeah.
So the other thing that I would love to talk to you about is chemsex. I think that it's a great topic because those of us whose drug of choice was methamphetamine and who are in recovery from it, we have a lot of conversations about chemsex and recovery from chemsex and how those things are so intertwined in that process. But I don't know that a lot of people are deeply familiar with what chemsex is and what the extra layer of that looks like in recovery.
And what do you mean about the extra layers of that?
Well, because it's not just a recovery from use, it's not just changing patterns of behavior. It's our entire, sex is such an important thing for human beings in general. And then your relationship with sex after meth is really never the same, in my opinion, or at least in my experience. Okay. And I know that, within our circles, we've had a lot of conversations like that. So I think that to me, that's that extra layer, this really important, vital part of our lives is changed sort of irrevocably.
Well, yeah. I agree with that. I think it's something that I wish community would normalize the discussion a little bit more around that, because it certainly has this connotation which sort of feeds the secrecy and shame part a lot, right? People want to hide that this is what they're doing, and they might hide it from their friends or their peer group. And I think that's where the complications kind of begin, because it's kind of living a duality or a double life. And again, I think that can be complicated for individuals depending upon where they are in that and their relationship to drugs and their drugs of choice. And it can, lead to sort of dark paths. And that certainly was reflective of my story, but I think that the shame component associated with that is why I wish the conversation was normalized a little bit more, right? And there's a lot of opportunities in regards to, highlighting that as an issue, right? But how to approach it, I think, with a degree of sensitivity and, non-judgment, and a genuine care for people's health and well-being. That certainly is central to my core as a queer person in regards to having that conversation and normalizing it so that it's approached with a delicacy that, sort of, highlights, yeah, we're going to go there.
Right.
Join me, meet me here.
Yeah. Well, and I think, at least within the group where we're acquainted, Strength Over Speed, where it's a group of gay and bisexual, et cetera, men talking about, the complications around meth, and sex is one of like the core parts of that conversation. And I think within that group, we've mastered how to have that conversation. Maybe not mastered. I don't know that we ever fully get there, but I think that nuance and that ability to make it comfortable and to make people feel respected is there. In our society, sex is already sort of stigmatized. It's already this like taboo topic that we don't want to talk about, and that's just vanilla sex. And then you layer on, queer sex and chemicals and substances, and now we're in a place that there is so many layers of shame that it's hard to dig back out of that.
Right. Well, I think, you touched upon several things that are, I think, important parts of the discussion around intersections of a lot of these issues. And I think, what we do really, really well is to talk about them, and I think people already know what's going on in their lives. So when they come to us, I think the most important part that we try to foster or nurture within that circle is to really allow individuals to be vulnerable and to have trust built within that, because then they will begin to talk about why they're there. And I think, we normalize the conversations in which that untangling of that ball, I kind of refer to it as this sort of ball of yarn with all these different colors in it. And you can make something out of it, but you're just looking at it and you just don't know where to begin, right? And I think that, slowly over time, people will start opening up and addressing some of these things. I think I just like cultivating space and just being in the present moment, because you never know what's going to happen. And I think that sort of that belief that the most present that I can be is the person feels like, oh, wow, I have this undevoted attention. And it's okay to like talk. I mean, that's what we do. And plus, all of our meetings are an hour and a half long. And that's a big commitment for people. And we can do a lot in an hour and a half, right?
Absolutely.
And the fact that people stay for the duration of that time is astounding to me in the ways that we talk about discomfort, right? And but I'm going to address some sort of key important elements of that is that, we might talk about, sex, but we also talk about, the importance of staying adherence to medication, frequency of getting STI checks, right? So we're a very sex positive group, but we really want to integrate the discussion around some of these other things that we can do, because it's not just the health of the individual, but it's the community health too. And so we kind of take this sort of 20,000-foot view of it, I guess, in regards to some of these things. But again, and it's not just methamphetamines, right? It's GHB and some other things too, and people can overdose, right? So we talk about that, about, the the reality that the drugs are stronger now, and it's not the methamphetamine of my childhood is something that I always say.
Right.
It is different, right? So how can I support you in this vision that you have for yourself as a person thinking about recovery? And what does recovery look like to you? I mean, I have a genuine interest in what people think, right? Because then I can approach them in a more deeper, loving way. Kind of like that hug that you mentioned earlier.
Yeah, you brought me in.
Because I know when people are uncomfortable, I can sense it in their body. One of my mentors taught me that. I still use that as an indicator about where people are, and just, because I think, it's, touch is another important part of, we don't talk about that enough as gay men. We want to go 0 to 100, right, to sex. And I think that there's nuances in there, like you said, about like that, and I think we're still unpacking that.
Yeah, absolutely. It's hard because, we do as gay men want to go straight to sex, but, touch can be intimate among friends too. It can be a kiss on the cheek, it can be a hug, it can be a touch of the arm. It doesn't always mean I, want to see your dick. Sometimes it does mean that too, but, it's not universal.
I often say friendship is a legitimate form of romance, right? It's about cultivating really healthy relationships. And I think it really sort of lays a foundation to have some of these hard conversations that we were talking about earlier. And I think it's important that we do that. We don't do that nearly enough. And so, yeah.
So you said something important a second ago about, what does recovery look like for you? And, I know that you are a huge proponent and advocate for harm reduction. And I know that can sometimes be a controversial topic. I know that it is now one of the taboo words that the federal government has put out there that's no longer allowed to be mentioned. So I'm wondering, one, why is harm reduction important? And two, has your definition of harm reduction evolved through your recovery?
Yes, it has. Well, I think it's important to say is that, the needle exchange used to be operated by a folding table downtown on 2nd and Pine. And I used to look and see who was working at the table because all my friends were working for the health department. And I didn't want them to see that I was going down. So that's how my introduction to harm reduction happened, right? And I think that over time, I knew the value of that because it's meeting a person where they're at. I mean, just basic human dignity and compassion, and I think when that is exhibited to people respond in good ways, and I think it really is about, strengthening those relationships so that people come back, right? And that, people are, given the appropriate time in regards to what their needs are, because again, they can be complicated. I often tell people it's like the biggest barrier to some of these things that we face as a society is politics. Because and it's, it's currently certainly represented in the sort of rhetoric that we hear. I have to be really conscientious of how I assign value to stay informed, right? Because, I think progress-wise, I wish we were farther ahead, but I'm still dedicated to, supporting people as a harm reduction advocate, right? Whether it's the supporting your local needle exchange, or
ending the HIV epidemic,
right? Or those wonderful dispensing machines that are located throughout the city. What a wonderful thing is that, because I think it really highlights that public health supports recovery at different stages of recovery, right? And that people have access to basic health stuff depending upon where they're at in their recovery process. I think that's really important. And people see that. They see that support is reflected back to them, and they become more, more apt to, go back there. I mean, people know when they're being supported.
And they know when they're not being supported,
and
too.
they know when they're not being supported, right? And I think that, I'm trying not to use curse words.
Well, you could probably use one. They'll bleep it for you.
But I think that, I would be remiss if I didn't say that I get upset or, disappointed when things happen to that magnitude. And I think it's reflective of how I was mentored in my early recovery and how people in certain divisions within public health supported the work that I was doing, and then that reciprocal nature of supporting their work, because we were all of us were doing the same thing. We were just coming at it from different angles, which is why I always, I went to AA and NA in the beginning part of my recovery, and then I sort of veered off into harm reduction. And, some of the people at my home group, were, I think they were sort of astounded that I was still doing that work. And I said, well, I think we're both doing the same thing. We're just coming at it from different angles. And I think that sort of support that I got from individuals and, within the health department and other divisions, I still remember some of those qualities that they instilled in me. And most of that was from harm reduction. And it's a good place, a good beginning. I don't know what more I can say beyond that.
Well, I mean, I think that really does help to define. I mean, I think the last thing you said is, it was all important, but it really distills, what does recovery mean for you? It means, as a community, we're coming at it from all angles, and, we're trying to leave room for what it means to the individual. Because for some people, that 12-step full abstinence model is what they need, and they need that structure, and that's what works for them. But, believing that is the only way is short-sighted. And, harm reduction opens up this whole other world of possibilities where we get to define our own recovery for us, or for ourselves. And it can evolve as we evolve, because I don't know about you, but I am not the same person that I was 10 years or 20 years ago. Are you? Were you the same person?
No, I am not the same person. I have evolved.
I thought so.
And so has my recovery's evolved too. I think I can distinctly remember when I went, you know what? I'm going to buy a bottle of white wine and I'm going to start cooking with it, because I was like, food is an important part of my health and well-being, right? And I kind of take care of myself. I mean, I've been living with HIV for almost 40 years. So, I think that, I need to take care of my body. It's kind of like a forest, I'm a tree, and I need to, take care of myself. But when I bought the liquor, I think somebody in my recovery came over and saw the bottle of wine in my refrigerator, and they were like, wow, what's this bottle of wine here? That kind of questioning. Oh, yeah. And I said, I cook with it.
Yep.
Oh, when did you start doing that? Those kind of questions, right? Where it's just like, the stigma comes out, right? Yep. And I don't have a problem stopping the conversation and go, you know what? I don't really like the tone of or how that was delivered. I'm an adult and I'm a person in recovery, and yeah, I cook with wine and sherry and red wine and sometimes other stuff.
Yeah, and I don't care what you think.
Yeah, right. I know. You know what I mastered recently? French onion soup.
What are you using for that?
Oh, you have to use sherry, but it's the right It's kind of like mathematical equations. You have to get the right proportions. And so,
Yeah, there's an art and a science to it.
There is an art and a science to it, yes.
Well, one of the things I want to talk about with you, and, this could be a whole other episode, but, listening to you say, that you have been living with HIV for 40 years, I want to talk about, the importance of research, and I want to talk about the importance of advocacy in the moment that we're living in right now. Because this is a large topic, and I'll let you go off as you see fit. But, you wouldn't be living for 40 years with HIV if it weren't for research. I've been living with HIV since 2008. There was a time where neither of us would be sitting here together having this conversation. And, we're watching the federal government gut science, gut research. And so that's one part. But, what do we do to advocate in this moment as we are watching these things be stripped away? How can we show up for each other, show up for our community? That's a very long-winded question. Now go.
Oh, my God. Well, that's kind of heavy.
It's a good way to end the show.
Right. Well, the reality is that we've all benefited from science. And I think a lot more people would be dead without that benefit. I mean, you have to look at everything from, oh my gosh, I'm looking for a specific word in my old brain. I think the the reality is that, medication, vaccinations, penicillin, we all benefit from that.
Absolutely.
Right? And that all originated from science. This is nothing new. The attack is nothing new. We have been here before. And I think that's what's so upsetting to me is that it's the continuance and the effort of, politics and people in power, who, have this sort of idea of the perfect America. And unfortunately, queer people, trans people more specifically right now, and science are being targeted, right? Right. And so I in these conversations, I can't help but stress the importance of things that they can't take away from us, right? Which are the relationships that all of us have forged over decades in the work that we do. And those networks and those relationships are still intact, right? Yes, they might be trying to dismiss, erase all of those efforts, right? But they can't take away the relationships that we have with one another. And and I think, that says something about what we've created and have helped to foster and have reciprocally benefited from that. Science has benefited from people living with HIV.
Absolutely.
Right? And I don't think that'll ever go away because people know the value and the importance of that. And so I have to have a degree of hope associated with that, right? Like I can remember when Peter Staley and ACT UP put a huge condom on Jesse Helms' house. Because, because of the attacks and everything that were happening in open, broad daylight. And, so what is recourse? What is the response, right? Like when you commented earlier about how I said, I love that. And I think love is a huge part of that, right? And I have to be really cognizant of, how I weave in and out of community. Right? Like, I am not immune to what's happening, nor am I ignorant to these things, right? But I can continue to do and show up. And what is my commitment? How can I in the face of all of that, how can I recommit my efforts to the things that are important to me? My sense of purpose, meaningful, right? Like we all have that. And I think that core sense of self in the work that we all do, whether we're a scientist or doing street outreach, I think all of those are necessary. And I just, I feel so strongly about my community because my community has loved and supported me. Everyone from research all the way down to, the folks working at the Needle Exchange, folding table, down on 2nd and Pine. So, yeah, it's real, right? It's real. I'm not going to, shy away from it, but it's also heavy, right? But you had a second part in that, and I'm hoping that my belabored response, I'm sorry, it kind of twirled out.
I think you mostly answered it. I think you got to both points because yeah, it was about research, but also about advocacy. And I think that I think you touched on both, but if you have more to add, I would love to hear.
Well, on advocacy, I think it's really important is that a person has to have agency before they can advocate, right? Like be comfortable with your story, own it wholeheartedly. Like Brene Brown said, if you don't own your story wholeheartedly, then you're outside of your story and you're hustling for your worthiness. And I think that, touches upon the sort of shame piece too, right? Like, I can remember hustling for my worthiness, as a young queer kid growing up in Tacoma and, realizing I'm not in a supportive household and getting out of Dodge, right? But fast forward to now, like, there's a degree of hustling that goes along with it, but yeah, I'm old school. Yeah, I like the hustling part, right? I think it's core and central to a lot of these sort of things that we're talking about, right? Like how Needle Exchange happened in Tacoma, right? And then ACT UP here and the pressure that it put on the health department. I mean, we've been doing this for our whole entire lives. And, we just have to, I think the other part is that a lot of these issues that we're talking about is that we are not single issue people. We have multiple issues happening and we have a variety of interests. And, this sort of a place that we find ourselves in is that it's going to be intersectional, right? It's going to be a lot of people coming together. And that is what I'm waiting for, right? Because it's going to happen all at once. I think people are trying to figure out what that is, what that role is for them, how can they show up. And I think that agency part that I was referring to earlier is a critical component to that, right? But also I think people know when they're being co-opted, right? Or when they're being used or tokenized in advocacy roles, right? And I think that people are acutely aware these days and to sort of, not take into accord those issues, that, people are a lot smarter. And so anyway, I'm here for all of it.
I love it. Well, and, we talk a lot about, stepping back and stepping up. And I don't think there's room for stepping back right now. I think it's all about, we've got to step up, and that doesn't mean the same thing for every person, but, there's not time to, we're already on our heels. So I think we have to step up now. It's time to step up.
Right. Well, I think a missing piece here is for each of us to check in with people. Like I go through my phone sometimes and will randomly kind of like spin it like I'm playing a game, and whatever my finger lands on, we'll call a person. right? Because everybody wants a text. I call people, like, hey, sometimes I tell them what I'm doing. Like, hey, I'm just randomly calling people to check in and check out, like, how are you doing? Because I have a lot of people who are scientists and work at the health department, if they don't answer, then I leave a message, and just let them know, like, wow, it's really heavy out there right now. How are you? I'm thinking about you. And, I also follow it up by saying thank you for what you do in this world. I don't think we say thank you enough to each other in the work that we do and the places that we, operate or go to and the people we serve. I think that, just genuine kindness can be a really important part of that.
Yeah, I think I would love to see us get back to that more. That's, as we move forward to this world, get back to the kindness. Yeah. So, well, as we close up, do you have any parting words or anything that we didn't cover that you want to touch on before we close out for the day?
Well, I think that some of these endeavors or some of these interventions or how people show up, it doesn't have to be big things. It can be little things, like I mentioned, like checking in with people, right? Another thing is, be interested in what other community members are doing because they're all feeling the same way, right? And because I look for ways that I can support other community members, like I can remember some of my trans friends years ago asked me to begin leveraging my power and influence, like effectively, a little more effectively. And that felt good, being pushed by community in that way, in that regard. And then so, community showed me how they wanted me to show up for them. And I think that's something that I would like to see more of, especially from, people with power and influence. Because people can do little things to support sort of broader things. And I think as those multiply, it has a better and a bigger impact because it's coming from community. And I think, again, they can't take away our networks or, what community is to us. And I think maybe that'll be a nice place for us to end today.
I think that's a beautiful place. I love that.
I love that too. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Tony, for being here. We could have talked for quite a while longer, I imagine, yes. But I appreciate the conversation. Yeah. So,
thank you for having me.
My pleasure.
Thank you, Orbit.
Well, thanks everybody for listening and watching. Thanks again, King County Recovery Coalition, King County Behavioral Health and Recovery Division, and great thanks to Nate and Orbit Audio for hosting us here today. See you all next time.